So I made a video.
Even the Kraus thing. I mean, there's something if you want to listen to something good, somebody did a really good piece on the betting thing and what they think is going on. It's pretty wacky, but sensible. I
Yeah.
think you'll find it on YouTube
Is it like
somewhere.
the 90-minute version?
Yeah, it's a long one. Yeah.
My
Yeah.
twin
Jack, there's a video I want to mention that I'll be referencing in a second in a different news story. Did you see that thing that MMA put out? The headline of their clip was the UFC has a major gambling problem.
Yes.
James Krause is only the beginning. And I want to shout out one more time that MMA video, which really put all the facts in the forefront. Check, this goes deeper, this Krause thing, than I really even realized.
But I absolutely could have done a better job with pacing and editing. Adidas, Adidas, Adidas steal, Adidas steal, Adidas steal. But I released it when I did because I realized a much larger structural flaw in MMA. One that I believe will make Krause look like a mere grain of sand on the beach in comparison. It may surprise you to hear this, but my last video on the UFC's business model was nearly 50% longer. I had written out an entire section on managers and how they could affect Krause's situation, as well as future debacles like his. But then something happened, as reported by David Perdue of ESPN. On December 6th of 2022, James Krause was barred from coaching fighters in a minor Midwestern U.S. MMA promotion known as FAC, or Fighting Alliance Championship. I found this very odd and vindictive. Why would the UFC strong-arm a tiny, barely known promotion into cutting Krause out? You see, Krause was only banned from licensing in Nevada, not Missouri, where FAC holds its events. So I continued to read. Quoting Perdue, Joe Wooster, a licensed matchmaker in Missouri and co-founder of FAC, told ESPN on Monday that Krause will have nothing to do with FAC 17. James is not any part of our ownership group, Wooster said when reached by phone. He's not the licensed promoter, not the licensed matchmaker. Just like every promotion in the Midwest, we use a bunch of his fighters, but he's in no way, shape, or form involved in the event. I know that the UFC kind of branded it James Krause's FAC, and that's just kind of what they do to extend their audience. They always try to associate a fighter with a promotion. That's where James kind of got his involvement. Later that same day, MMA insiders reported the following, which was confirmed by MMA Mania. Quote, Krause had decided to sell all ownership in Glory MMA and Fitness, along with its affiliates, to FAC owner and Iridium Sports agent Joe Wooster. Wooster, it turns out, runs the Midwestern U.S. region of Iridium's fighter management arm. As such, Wooster is simultaneously an MMA matchmaker and an MMA agent. This introduces the possibility of conflicts of interest. To understand that term simply, a conflict of interest occurs when an individual's personal interests, family, friendships, financial, or social factors, can compromise his or her judgment, decisions, or actions in the workplace. To contextualize this example, could Wooster choose a fighter he represents when a big fight is being lined up for a FAC card over that of a more deserving but non-Iridium fighter in FAC? The important thing to note is that it doesn't have to have occurred for it to be considered a conflict of interest. It's purely the assertion that it could happen that constitutes a conflict. That binary is incredibly important to understand. It's all about the perception of impropriety. So why is Krause selling his gym to his agent? A reasonable question. But unfortunately, it's not one that has any publicly reported reasoning to it. If we are to understand the dynamics at play, we are going to have to discuss Iridium as a whole. This is Jason House, founder and CEO of Iridium Sports Agency. House went onto the MMA Hour in mid-November of 2022 to discuss various aspects of Iridium and his star client, Brandon Moreno. Here he is discussing his beginnings in the sport.
So your history in the sport, it's been going back well over a decade, right?
Yeah.
And actually, in doing a little bit of research on you, a name popped up that I had not heard of in quite some time. A guy that I used to be quite close with, Ken Pavia.
Yes.
The new fans watch it. The ESPN fans, they don't know Ken Pavia,
Yeah.
but the OGs know Ken Pavia. So he's the reason why you got into this?
Yes, he actually spoke to my law school.
This is Ken Pavia, former MMA manager himself. Yeah.
Yes, he came to my law school the last semester of my last year in law school.
What school?
Whittier Law School in Costa Mesa, in Orange County, California.
And here he is talking about the timeline of his launching of Iridium.
When do you actually start Iridium? When does that launch?
So I graduated law school, I think like May 24th of 2009. I formed it August 20th of 2009.
So House has been working as an agent for over a decade now, but his success is altogether relatively recent. House talks here about how he had to decide between being purely an MMA agent or to branch out into other sports to expand his business.
And I remember at the time being really torn on what I want to do with my life. You know, private sector didn't really fulfill me. The public sector wasn't doing it either. So when Ken came, it was kind of a godsend. I was like, yes, I want to do that. So when he came and, you know, I must have called him 4 or 5 straight days in a row, like, hey, I intern for you? Can I do anything? And, you know, within 2 weeks later or a few weeks later, I was at a UFC event with him working and
So you were
the
working
ropes.
for MMA agents?
Yes.
And how long was that for?
Till I graduated law school that following May. Then I decided to go on my own.
But success didn't come fast, and he attempted to branch into NFL management as well.
If there's ever a moment you're like, man, this is what I'm supposed to do, I felt like it was in that moment.
So you realize, all right, this is where I want to be. These are the people I want to work with. But you also are a certified NFL agent too.
Correct.
When did that happen?
So in 2016, one of the marketing groups that I was working with, they started helping out NFL athletes. And they're like, hey, Jay, you should get into this. I think you'd be really good at it. So I took the test.
But everything changed for House rapidly with the launch of the UFC's new talent acquisition pipeline.
Take the test, pass, start working with football players, and then the Contender Series starts in 2017. And we had a lot of initial success. You know, our agency's always been a grassroots of building athletes on the regional scene and getting them to the UFC. Then 2018 came and it grew even more. And then it became a point where I realized, man, do I want to fight for a market share in the NFL, maybe be a jack of all trades, master of none? Or do I stick with my passion, my calling, and go all in on MMA? And we decided to do MMA.
House hints at it here, but his ability to get fighters onto the show and win them contracts really exploded Iridium into one of the premier management agencies in the UFC. In fact, they may have the largest roster of pro MMA fighters as well as active UFC fighters.
He sent me your roster. You represent over 300 UFC MMA athletes, correct?
Correct.
How is that possible? How do you have the mental capacity, the time, the energy? And I know you have other people who work for Iridium as well. But 300 is a massive number. Dare I say probably the biggest number in the sport?
Probably.
I don't see anyone coming close to that. How is that possible?
There, Ariel asks the key question. How is that possible? MMA management as an industry is tremendously stagnant. The top managers today have been the top managers for a long, long time. So, he must be poaching fighters from other managers, right? Just absolutely slumming it in the trenches and muck of managerial competition.
And so now you've been doing it 13 or so years.
Yeah.
And that was something I wanted to ask you about because it does feel, and maybe there've been instances here or there, but like you're not the type of manager that is going to try to get guys who are rep by other guys. Like you're trying to get the guys coming up through the regional scene, LFA, build them up.
To not only enter their ranks, but to exceed basically all of them without resorting to poaching is a testament to House's business acumen. Here's House talking about what he considers one of the keys to his success.
How did you develop, one thing I always hear about you is you have a very good relationship with the UFC brass. Some managers don't, some do. But I always hear that you're, in very good standing with them. There's a science to that as well, right? That could be a tricky dance. Sometimes they like managers, sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
How did you develop that good relationship? And in particular, I think it's with Sean and Mick, the matchmakers, but it seems like everyone at the UFC has a lot of respect for you.
Quickly, let's establish who those two figures are. First, Sean Shelby. Sean is the matchmaker for the following men's divisions in the UFC. And conversely, here is Mick Maynard and the men's divisions he handles. Okay, back to House's answer.
How did that happen?
Really, I just treat it like my marriage, right? I keep those discussions behind closed doors. I think one of the things that I learned on the football side was that anytime a negotiation went public, it didn't really end well, right? Ego gets involved, people are upset, things were said publicly. I've always tried to keep things behind closed doors, and that's not to say I don't get into it with Mick or Sean or Hunter or any of them, but I think if we keep it in a professional manner and keep it behind closed doors, it always maintains that relationship because what you always have to keep in mind, this is the infinite game, right? This is a long-lasting relationship. That's probably a 20, 30, 40-year relationship for me, right? And so I have to treat it with that respect and care in every negotiation.
So, therein lies the key to House's rise. House rejects the slimy aspects of management in the form of poaching fighters in favor of a much more professional and symbiotic relationship with executives and even other managers, as he states here.
Is there a number that you're like, all right, we can't surpass this? I can't get to 400. I can't get to 500.
It really depends on what acquisitions we decide to make this year. If we, merge with other agencies or we partner with other agents, I think that really will determine that. A lot of our growth has been, partnering with other agents. So that's why it may seem like a lot as a number, but then when you think about it, we're bringing in the infrastructure to sustain that model.
But something really stuck in my head from an earlier clip I played.
Take the test, pass, start working with football players, and then the Contender Series starts in 2017. And we had a lot of initial success. Our agency's always been a grassroots of building athletes on the regional scene and getting them to the UFC.
If we sort of read between the lines of what House is saying in that clip, his strategy really wasn't all that effective until the launch of DWCS and the opening it created for Iridium and its clients to get seen and signed to the UFC, right? So is there more beneath the surface to how House went from essentially irrelevancy to fielding the largest MMA roster in the sport? This is a data-based channel. I have my own opinions, but if they lack data backing, I tend to abandon them. As such, I did something stupid. I went through every single Dana White's Contender Series fight in history and manually pulled if the fighter was managed by Iridium at the time of the fight. In a way, we can use this data to approximate how successful Iridium is at bringing talent on to the UFC. In the spirit of open sourcing knowledge, I have a copy of all the fights and my labeling of them uploaded for free over on our Patreon, which you can find a link to in the description. Before I get to the results though, you the viewer should keep in mind two facts. One, Iridium's website, which I used for this section, is not up to date with our entire roster. There are numerous fighters that I know they rep, but aren't on the website. As such, my numbers are probably underestimating totals. And two, there are numerous misspellings on their website. I did my best to fix them, but it is certainly possible that a misspelled name or two caused me to undercount just how many fighters they represent. So, if we take all male Dana White Contender Series fights from the beginning of the show to present, Iridium has repped 88 fighters out of a total of 518. 53 of those 88 won their fights. We can say that Iridium alone accounts for nearly 17% of all male fighters that enter into Dana White's Contender Series. But more importantly though, Iridium fighters win a strong 60% rate. But I noticed something. Out of those 518 fighters and thus 259 total fights, 8 times 2 Iridium fighters faced each other. The obvious question sprang to my mind. How can an agent go to a fighter and tell them with a straight face that they are going to win a fight when they are giving that exact same conversation to their opponent behind their back? To me, there seems to be a really odd conflict of interest at play here. Iridium can't say with complete confidence that they are looking out for just their fighter's best interest when they are facing them off against each other. In the end, one fighter has to lose the fight, so if they tell both that they are going to win, then they are lying to one of them, right? The problem in my eyes is magnified considering that they are in a situation where their entire future is on the line. Remember a couple years back when Kamaru Usman and Gilbert Burns were in a similar situation? Gilbert, who like Kamaru is managed by Dominance MMA, earned his way to a title shot versus Usman, which naturally created a rift between the two, as both train at then Sanford, now Killcliff FC. Kamaru was so mad in fact that he left the gym over it. So historically, fighters are not huge fans of facing each other, yet it occurred 8 separate times on Dana White's Contender Series. As I was pulling those names though, I began to notice another trend with Iridium's roster. They manage a ton of ranked fighters at flyweight and bantamweight. That sort of managerial conflict of interest isn't just purely a question about the fiduciary ethics of facing fighters against each other though, is it? My mind immediately jumps to the questions of merit. Remember when Jorge Masvidal got back-to-back title shots versus Kamaru Usman over the substantially more deserving Leon Edwards? The same Edwards that just ended Kamaru's title reign by head kick knockout. That probably happened because Masvidal was one of the 3 biggest draws in the sport at the time, right? Certainly not because he earned his way there with wins over Darren Till, Ben Askren, and Nate Diaz. But how about an older example? After Michael Bisping, who was ranked number 4, was given a surprise title shot against Luke Rockhold, and in an all-time upset knocked him unconscious to win the middleweight title, who was his first opponent? An immediate rematch with the former title holder Rockhold? What about an all-time great middleweight, Chris Weidman, who lost his belt to Rockhold after defeating the widely considered greatest middleweight of all time, Anderson Silva, twice in a row? Oh, I know, it was the absolute freak of nature Yoel Romero coming off a blazing 7-fight win streak to remain undefeated in the UFC at the time. Nope. Number 11 ranked Dan Henderson stepped in for Bisping's first defense at a whopping 46 years old. Bisping went on to win a 5-round decision. But why did they choose Dan? Because Bisping had a long-term rivalry dating back to this unnecessary follow-up shot so the UFC could cash in on pay-per-view buys for the grudge match. Now, House hasn't spent a single solitary second competing in the cage, yet his ability to advocate for title shots could mean the difference between these fighters achieving their dream or ending up washed out like the rest in the path to glory. What if House decides to fatten his wallet by making the same Faustian bargain with the executives that led to Masvidal v. Usman and Bisping v. Henderson? Or fighters that earned their place through blood and sweat, not memes and catchphrases. And you know what? This section of the interview keeps ringing in my head as I talk about this.
How did you develop, one thing I always hear about you is you have a very good relationship with the UFC brass. Some managers don't, some do.
Yeah.
How did you develop that good relationship? And in particular, I think it's with Sean and Mick, the matchmakers.
They do seem particularly close, don't they? Shelby and Mick not only matchmake for UFC fights, but for the Dana White Contender Series fights too. To put my conspiratorial thought to rest, I decided to split out Iridium fighter appearances and victories based on the weight classes that Mick and Sean matchmake for respectively. Before I show the data, remember that if Iridium's appearance rate is 50% or greater, that would mean that on average, every Dana White's Contender Series fight has at least one Iridium fighter in it. So let's see the stats on the weight classes Mick manages. Okay, and now Sean. So on average, 1 out of every 2 fights on Dana White's Contender Series that Sean matchmakes feature a fighter from Iridium. For Mick, the same figure is 1 out of every 5. Before the sample size police come after me, Sean has been involved in 131 fights compared to 128 for Mick. Here's the question that I have no answer to, but purely an opinion. House's job as a manager is to look out for the professional and financial well-being of those he represents. That is how he earns his percentage. So the question I ask of you, the viewer, is he doing that job ethically and effectively? Here's a story to set the stage for your answer. July of 2019, Sean O'Malley falls out of a matchup with Marlon Chito Vera due to a positive USADA test. Not wanting to lose out on a fight for his client, House offers the UFC the ability to sign one of his stable that has been bouncing around various regional promotions. That fighter? Noelin Hernandez, who was 9-2 as a professional MMA fighter at the time. Chito finishes him by rear naked choke, followed by another loss to Jack Shore, also by rear naked choke. Hernandez is then cut after going 0-2 in the UFC, bounced by 2 of the best contenders in the weight class. Noelin's record since the UFC? 2-3, likely putting the nail in the coffin for a fighter who turns 29 in March of 2023. On one side, getting Chito that late replacement puts another check in Vera's pocket that feeds his family. Hernandez also got paid 2 show checks for the fights. On the other side, though, it comes at the expense of Nolan's future opportunities in the sport, while also systematically reducing average fighter pay by dropping the competitiveness of the market as a whole. This is the point inherent to that initial question I asked of you, and ideally it is one that House asks himself every day. Now, I have thrown a lot at you, but I need you to understand that the implications I am making are only a small piece of the pie. While this is all dawning on me, this question never left my mind. Why is Fight Pass and the UFC by extension paying for broadcasting rights to a tiny promotion, FAC, that I have never heard of? And that's where the rabbit hole gets deeper.